Boa tarde a todos. Everything in English? Okay, that's not a big problem. Okay, so good afternoon and welcome back to the conference here that we're doing in conjunction with the INCT and the PPED, National Perspectives in a Global Economy, Rethinking State Capacities, Public Policies, and the Brazilian Crisis. And let me open up this section by saying that this panel and the following one, they are sort of special for us, the Minds team here, because they are the closing moment of two research projects that the Ford Foundation funded, and we're very happy in a way for the results and very much frustrated by the fact that the Brazilian government decided to go in a completely different and 180 degrees away from almost all things that we suggest in the Brazilian part of the projects. The projects were one called Financial Institutions for Innovation and Development, the cases of Brazil and China. This was first coordinated by Rogério Sobreira here, formerly Executive Director of Minds, now at Development Bank of Minas Gerais, and then coordinated by myself. The second one, Financial Fragility and Financial Governance in Brazil, Analysis and Policy Recommendations, coordinated by Felipe Rezende here at my side. And both of them under, let's say, the intellectual supervision and guidance of our mentor here. I can speak for myself and for Felipe for sure, maybe not for Laura, or maybe for Laura as well, Jan Kregel here at my side. And here in particular, I want to pause and make a special sort of make a special thanks for Jan Kregel. Jan was always a tremendous asset for us in my time at the Ford Foundation. Ok, mas tenta ver se... Okay, so Jan was always a tremendous asset in my time in New York when I was running the financial global. What was the name of the initiative? Because it was global economic governance at first, and then it became reforming global finance with the financial crisis. And Jan was really central, front and center in terms of advising me, criticizing me when was the case, advising, collaborating, etc. And this is really impressive because, as I think almost all of you in this room happen to know, Jan is simply one of the most accomplished economists working today in the world. He's very shy, so he's not in the press as he should and as we would like him to be. But clearly one of the best economists, if not the best, especially on macrofinance. I don't know anybody who knows more than my friend here. And to me, it was a really fortunate chapter in my intellectual, let's say, development to be able to have Jan first as someone who I studied in my undergrad and graduate courses, and then to have the great opportunity of having him as a collaborator or reversely. It became his collaborator, we published together, and he became a very good friend. So let me thank you, Jan, for this great opportunity, and thank you also for all the things you did and you still do for minds and for us and for our intellectual development. Secondly, I would like to thank a lot of people in this room and a lot of people who are not here that were part and are part of our effort. And this includes Felipe here, obviously Jan, Rogério here, Luis Fernando de Paula, Alexis Dantas, and many others which are not here. But Ana Célia, of course, always helping and always organizing and always, like Robert said yesterday, a truly Schumpeterian entrepreneur in all things related to organizational skills and organizing big conferences and things like that. So this is really a great moment for us, again, in terms of thanking you all, the ones that are here and the ones who are not here as well. And let me just conclude by saying that the results, the partial results of the research are available at the Minds website, www.minds.org.br. They are in this book here that we have. The China and Brazil part is already published. This was a conference that we did with BNDES, and I have to thank Luciano Coutinho, Professor Luciano Coutinho, former president of BNDES here, and as well as João Carlos Ferraz, former director of the BNDES, which helped us a lot in that conference that we did a couple of years ago. The results are in this book. And we will have, in addition to that, 3 other books that will be published in the first semester of 2017. First one is the full report coordinated by Felipe on financial fragility and financial governance in Brazil, with contributions by Jan, well, obviously the major contributions by Jan and Felipe, but also chapters by Daniela Prates, by Hernani Torres and Macaíba, by Rogério Sobreira. So we'll have a lengthy report on that. We also have a book on the press articles that Felipe published and that called so much attention because it was one of the few, along with Laura and Nelson Marconi here, one of the very few dissent opinions in the media in this sort of complete, almost conspiracy theory in terms of going into austericide and all those things that we are seeing right now. And the last one is a booklet that will be produced by myself and Felipe in 2 parts, which will be like Minsky meets China and Minsky meets Brazil. So those are the things that we have in the pipeline. And having said that, thank you again for listening for this, but I think I had to say that. And let's get to the session. And let me just warn you or tell you, brace for impact. Because what you will be hearing here is going to be very different from the whole host of diagnostics, analysis, etc. that you're seeing in the media, in the official economists, and in the press in general. We're going in a very different direction, and I hope you will enjoy that. Thanks again. Jan, the floor is yours. Thank you.
To a Brazilian audience, unfortunately, I don't have anything very optimistic to say. And in fact, you probably gave me 20 minutes too long because Armageddon can be explained relatively rapidly. But since you've given me 20 minutes, I'll try and explain why the current policy discussions that are going on in Brazil are probably ignoring a basic element. And that basic element is, you probably think I'm going to say Trumpageddon. I'm not going to speak directly about Mr. Trump. I'm going to be talking about the constellation of international financial flows that have arisen since the great financial crisis, which have created substantial financial instability, in Minsky's terms, in emerging markets. And given the likely changes that we are going to see in U.S. economic policy, a very detrimental impact on the ability of emerging markets, and in particular Brazil, to operate the kinds of policies which they believe are necessary for their recovery. And when I'm talking about the kinds of policies in this context, we can refer to both Brazil and Argentina, who believe that somehow or other their recovery is going to be based on creating financial conditions which are suitable to generate foreign investment flows and the increase in demand via investment from foreign investors, which are going to produce the kind of demand which would allow some sort of fiscal consolidation and allow some sort of recovery. Argentina happens to be leading Brazil in this particular race because they're collapsing much more rapidly than Brazil is, and they are taking measures which are much less effective in attempts to reduce their fiscal balances, but in general the policies are more or less the same. That is, attempts to create a reduction in fiscal deficits, to move to fiscal surpluses, and the idea is that these fiscal surpluses will create the financial conditions which will generate the foreign capital inflows that are required for recovery. Now, those of you who are familiar with a lot of the earlier work that I've done, in particular the work associated with the idea of new developmentalism and the work of Professor Bresser, note that neither of us are particularly positive about the role of foreign direct investment. In fact, Bresser usually starts out by his presentation saying, "No foreign savings, please." What I usually do is to make my presentations in explaining why foreign savings, in fact, will not produce the kinds of results that most people expect, and why it is, for that reason, necessary to rely on domestic financial institutions. And in particular, the domestic financial institutions that are available in most developing countries are not private sector financial institutions, but are in fact public sector financial institutions. And this is why it's extremely important to look at, in particular in the present crisis, the idea that somehow or other infrastructure investment is going to be a source of attraction for foreign investors. We know that even for private investors, infrastructure investment is not the kind of investment that generates identifiable returns, and in most cases this means the requirement of having some sort of public-private partnership or some sort of contingent guarantee by the government or by a public bank in order to encourage the kinds of private investment that one would require. So the idea is that basically, if you look at the recovery does not come from abroad. Abroad is going to be a negative rather than a positive, and it is going to be extremely important to focus on domestic financial institutions. Now, this is, as people who know my presentations, I usually start out by giving the conclusion first. So now if you all want to go and have coffee, you can do that. And we can go through the oh dear, okay, let's see if this is going to in fact work. No, let's try this. That's going to work. Okay. I would like just to start out to place the global financial crisis in context. Basically, what we're talking about is something that was called at one stage the Great Moderation. It was called the Great Moderation by central bankers because in general it was a period in which rampant inflation had disappeared and more or less positive real GDP growth had existed. The central bankers usually took responsibility for this, that it was the genial policies, the congenial policies of the central bankers that in fact had produced the Great Moderation. As a good friend of mine, Andrew Sheng, always points out, the central bankers conveniently forgot that during this period the global labor markets included an additional 400,000 Chinese workers at extremely low wages, and that if you're trying to get rid of cost inflation, the easiest way to do this is by decreasing your labor costs. Okay, so if we take the two basic themes behind the Great Moderation, I'm going to argue them in a slightly different way. It was really not the central bankers. First, if we look on the globalization side, the globalization of production basically produced a supply-side response in terms of a massive increase in the output of manufactured goods through the increase of global production chains and the shifting, the outsourcing of production. Basically, what this did was to drive the prices of manufactured goods down, and as a response to the stagnant stagnant nominal incomes in developed countries, this was a major factor in allowing the incomes of developed countries, the wage incomes of developed countries, to have some sort of stability. So it didn't come from increasing wages, it in fact came from the decline of prices that was produced by globalization. The second factor was financialization. Financialization is, I would call, well, in general is defined as the rise of the so-called FIRE sector, finance, insurance, real estate. But in fact, financialization, as we experienced it after the 1980s, was simply the ability of a deregulated financial sector to do more or less the same thing that we saw on the real side. That is, financial institutions produced massive amounts of innovation that produced massive increases in liquidity. And this massive increase in liquidity produced an increased demand for financial assets, which did what? Well, basically, it reduced the rates of return on financial assets. So if we look at these two things together, globalization and financialization, if you were a manufacturer producing real goods and services, your prices were declining relative to your domestic wage costs, so that the only thing you could do was get out of the country because the rates of return were declining. If you looked at an investor investing in financial assets, the rates of return on financial assets were also declining. So if we look at this, no, I don't want to go there. Where do I want to go? I want to go to Minsky. The argument that I'm trying to make is that this Great Moderation had in and of itself characteristics of increasing financial instability. Why? Well, Minsky talks about the idea of the two-price system. Okay, he says you have a price of your produced goods, basically your production goods, and the price of the production goods are the things that generate profits, and the generation of profits allows you to service the debts that you incur in order to engage in production. So on the globalization side, if your prices and your pricing power is falling, that means your ability to service debts become more and more compromised. On the other side, on the financialization side, what's happening is you have increasing rates of creation of financial assets that are pushing down these the rates of return on financial assets. So basically, you end up with firms with a much lower capacity in their domestic production in order to meet their debt service, and at the same time you end up with financial institutions facing lower and lower rates of return, which then leads us, as we said, to this idea of the reach for yield. Throughout the Great Moderation, the basic Great Moderation increase in prices, we said, was no longer in commodity prices, but in fact in financial asset prices. And this increase in financial asset prices produced this series of what we would call financial bubbles over the period of the 80s, the 90s, and the 2000s. That is, we had repetitive financial bubbles as the financial system reached what we call reaching for yield. I can still remember drafting a trade and development report that was produced in the end of the 1980s, the early 1990s, and we talked about the problem of reaching for yield. Well, every time we have a run-up to a crisis, we discover that we have a reach for yield, and that reach for yield is financial institutions taking on more and more risk, borrowing more and more, and being less and less capable to service their debt. Now, if you look at this from the point of view of the developing world, in particular from the point of view of Brazil, all of these financial bubbles were accompanied by a second set of increasing prices in commodities. Okay? If we look at the response to the dot-com bubble, financial institutions, after the dot-com bubble, moved most of their clients into two kinds of investments, what they called real investments. Okay? The decline in the return on financial assets was too low, so they moved into real estate. This was the first creation of lending into the subprime crisis. If you look at the chart, it starts in about 2002 and 2003, and you can see the amount of lending going into real estate in the developed countries increasing extremely rapidly. Interestingly enough, exact commodity funds start expanding at exactly the same time. And this is when you get to the commodity boom. So that from the point of view of developing countries, they were facing a sort of a dual impact of this in terms of increasing commodity prices, and in fact you can think of the increasing terms of trade for developing countries as the equivalent of a two-price system. The ability to generate revenues as a result of the commodity price boom, in fact, increased national incomes, but at the same time, the impact on the exchange rate placed a very, very sharp burden on the manufacturing sector. And this is the point at which the deindustrialization that we're so familiar with started in Brazil. Now, the problem with this is what? Well, the problem with this is none of these are, in fact, sustainable. I can remember this must be now 8 years ago, going to a meeting of the Conselho de Econômico e Social and making a presentation in which I said, Brazil is a bubble economy. I was, of course, widely attacked because all my friends said, you can't attack President Lula. And I said, this has nothing to do with President Lula. This has to do with international financial markets. And if people don't recognize that this is having an impact on the structure of production, eventually there is going to be a cost to be paid for this. And effectively, this is the cost which came back when the great financial crisis emerged. So we can look at this problem of the compatibility of these two prices impact on developed and developing countries as basically coming home to roost. And they were all the result of this great, so-called great moderation, which produced a stability which people presumed was stability, but in fact hid a substantial amount of financial instability. So basically, as I say, what I'm arguing here is that the Great Moderation was effectively a Ponzi scheme, but most people did not recognize it. This we can skip. Now, if we look at the period after the Great Financial Crisis, we had policy responses. Those policy responses were of two types. One, zero interest rate, quantitative easing, and all sorts of policies that attempted to push banks into expanding lending in order to finance recovery. None of these policies, in fact, worked. Why didn't they work? Well, one of the reasons they didn't work was at the same time we had a regulatory movement that was doing exactly the opposite. Okay, if you think of ZIRP, QE, and all of these policies, they are urging people to take increasing amounts of risk, that is, to move out of safe government securities. The banks refused to do it. Private investors refused to do it. Why? Well, the regulatory scheme was telling them to do just the opposite. So we had a contradictory message being sent to the private sector. On the one hand, monetary policy is expand lending. On the other hand, regulatory policy is don't expand lending. Reduce your exposure, de-lever. So, in fact, what we had was effectively a stalemate. Now, during this period, we had substantial complaints which came from developing countries. In particular, Finance Minister Mantega talked about currency wars and waves of funds moving into Brazil and other emerging markets. Now, the problem with this story, for anybody who looked at the balance sheet of U.S. financial institutions, like myself, which I do frequently, is that there was no evidence of this. All of the funds that the Fed transferred to the banks, in fact, stayed on the banks' balance sheets. According to Dennis Robertson's famous phrase, any money that is somewhere, anywhere must be somewhere. So if it's on the balance sheets of the banks in New York, it can't be in Brazil. And eventually the BIS very nicely produced a study which validated this particular position. Indeed, some observers imagine that the excess reserves in the U.S. banking system created by the Federal Reserve to pay for the large-scale bond purchases are spilling into the rest of the world, financing dollar credit. In fact, this turns out not to be true. Not only not to be true, the opposite was true. If anything, interbank inflows helped to fund the buildup of excess reserves in the United States rather than these reserves inducing outflows. And this makes a great deal of sense, because if you're delevering and you're reducing your balance sheets, you're calling in your foreign liabilities, and in fact, this is what was happening for the U.S. financial system. So this leaves us with the question, where did the money come from? Because clearly, Mantega was not imagining that this was happening. Okay, this was not a dream. In fact, the money was flowing in, and the question that comes up is exactly where did it come from? Obviously here, the chart, which is produced by the same BIS study, shows you that in fact the banks, in fact, were not involved in this, but what was involved was a large increase in the issue of bonds outside the United States. We look at this particular chart. This measures the $8 trillion of money that was generated by non-bank borrowers, and you can see the two center arrows come from the U.S. financial system. The rest of it come from outside the U.S. financial system. Now, the important part of this is that a large proportion was in non-financial corporations issuing bonds outside of the United States in US dollars. So here we have the difference between advanced economies showing nothing, the emerging markets showing this very sharp increase, Brazil showing a trend increase over the period after the crisis. Here, if you look at US dollar credit to non-financial borrowers from Brazil, we have a very, very large increase after the what I would call the response to the Brazilian crisis in 2010. So a large proportion of these non-financial corporate issues were in fact by Brazilian companies. This is a table which comes from a IBMX study which came out recently showing the increase, if you take column number 3, the increase in foreign debt, in total debt of a panel of Brazilian companies rising in 2010. As I say, this is the beginning of the failed response to the crisis. It doubles over that period in terms of the total. Now, the really depressing part of all this, I mean, you can say, okay, we were very happy that developing country non-financial corporations were able to borrow these funds. But the question is, in the midst of what was a very, very slow recovery from the financial crisis, the idea was that these funds were supposed to be used for recovery. But there was no recovery. So why are you borrowing all of this money if there is no recovery and you're not spending it? Well, a second BIS study shows us the response to that, and that is primarily that these funds were used in order to finance carry trades. So that if you were an Asian non-financial corporation issuing in dollars, and the largest share of these, in fact, were done by Asian issuers, you were borrowing funds in dollars, okay, at a term which was about 5 to 7 years, and then you were using it to fund investments into Brazil. So that the other side of the story was that Brazilian corporations were issuing their own debt, but at the same time, Brazil was receiving most of the rest of the non-financial corporate debt in terms of carry trade flows. And this is Finance Minister Manteiga's currency war and the wall of money, which had this massive impact on Brazilian exchange rates and Brazilian inflows. Now, well, we won't do that today. If we look at the impact of this, consider this relative to the conditions of the 1980s. Okay, you remember the lost decade of the 1980s? Well, a lot of you are too young to do that, but most of the rest of us do remember the lost decade of the 1980s. Then we had a very similar position in which there were massive inflows into Latin America, but these were what we call syndicated loans by U.S. banks. Okay? U.S. banks became insolvent, and as a result, there was default, widespread default, which was met by the policy of the Federal Reserve in order to support the U.S. banking system in a sort of muddling through operation. And at the same time, this was caused by what? Well, the Volcker surprise, the increase in interest rates, the appreciation of the US dollar, and bond defaults. Okay? The difference here is that the US banks were on the hook for the credit risk in the 1980s. The US banks, remember I said the US banks are sitting there with their excess reserves. The US banks are not exposed, well, virtually at all to this new round of capital flows and flow instability. The exposures are where? The exposures are in the emerging market non-financial corporates, and they are in the emerging market domestic policies in terms of management of domestic monetary policy and in terms of management to exchange rates. So if we look at today, we have the possibility of saying, well, in difference from the Volcker surprise increasing interest rates, we now have the Trump surprise. What is the likely impact of Trump's policies? God only knows. But we do know that there will probably be two elements. One element is going to be tax reduction, and the other element is going to be some sort of increase in infrastructure spending. We know that as a result of these two factors, economists are now predicting that the US economy is likely to grow at something like 3% next year. This is never going to happen. But if you're Janet Yellen at the Federal Reserve and you have an unemployment rate of 4% and you've been waiting to increase interest rates, it is virtually certain that the Fed will increase rates in December. We are in December, next week in fact, and it may not be 25 basis points, it may be 50 basis points. And it's virtually certain that if some of these policies are implemented, the Fed taking preemptory policies, Alan Greenspan invented that term, that is, the central bank has to move first before inflation arises. It means that we will have a stepwise increase in interest rates back to normal probably by the end of next year, which means that we may be up to, say, 2.5% in terms of the Fed policy rate. The dollar is already out of this world, and this kind of increase in interest rates will only make it that much stronger. So that even without Trump, in fact, doing anything in Congress, without even, in fact, taking the position of president, we have conditions which are going to lead very likely to a further unwinding of the carry trade flows and to difficulties in domestic financing. Now, I refer again to this, the note that IBMEC, the CMEC study that IBMEC produced, and I won't read through the whole thing. The bottom line says what? The bottom line says that of these 256 Brazilian firms that account for something like 60% of the entire Brazilian indebtedness, over half of these firms don't have cash flows that are sufficient in order to meet their debt service. Okay? Now, as you know, Minsky defines this as a Ponzi scheme. When you're in a Ponzi scheme, what do you have to do? You have to go to the bank and you have to say to the bank, will you lend me the money to pay my debt service? Now, the conditions that the bank are going to push are going to be, okay, show me your balance sheet. And if the firm shows up with a balance sheet which is primarily denominated in US dollars, and in terms of fixed interest debt, okay, we have exactly the same double negative impact that we saw in the 1980s. Okay, the domestic value of your debt increases, and the value, the market value of your bonds decreases. So the difficulty firms are going to have in meeting this sort of condition will be extremely impacted by international conditions and particular conditions in the US market. Now, if at the same time the government introduces policies which are contractionary, it makes it that much more difficult for firms to meet their payments, which is currently the case if I read the Brazilian macro statistics correctly. If I read the government policy statements correctly, the government will be contributing to this decline in the operating earnings of Brazilian firms, and therefore contributing to the inability or increasing instability of the domestic production sector. Now, this is all a period in which the only response that countries really have for declining domestic demand is to expand exports. Okay? Now, the probability of expanding exports, number one, leave Donald Trump aside and what his policies will do on international trading conditions. International trade has already been declining at an extremely rapid rate, even as the US and other economies have recovered, first of all. Second of all, you have to have something to export. And it's not clear that commodity prices are going to produce the kinds of response that Brazil would need. In any case, primary commodity exports are not a very large generator of domestic employment and a very large generator of domestic income. So if primarily the manufacturing sector is on the level of reaching default, then the only sector which could possibly provide some sort of stimulus to domestic demand looks like it will be absolutely incapable. And it's at this point, which I said, the bottom line of all of this story is, number one, we should never have gotten into this mess in the first place, okay? And number two, you can only get out of this mess first by generating domestic demand, and number two, by using the domestic financial system in order to provide the financing which would allow the domestic production sector to recover. I go back in closing to Mr. Volcker. Okay? Volcker, when he was apprised of the fact that the largest US banks had exposures that were something like 300 to 400% of their equity, and that emerging market economies like Brazil were about to default, and his staff said to him, how are we going to manage the bankruptcy of these banks? Volcker's response was, tell the banks to continue to lend. Keep lending. And the banker said, but we're lending to borrowers that are insolvent. And Volcker said, yes, I know. But if the banks become insolvent and the firms become insolvent, then the system becomes insolvent. And that's what we have to avoid.
follow up on this, I'm very happy to be here speaking today, in particular when Ian is on the same panel. And on this, I'll follow up on Leonardo's comments that, and I'll quote Harcourt, who said that Ian is considered to be the best all-round general economist alive, and I couldn't agree more that this is the case. And I think it's also time to provide a little background on this project, which I coordinated in Brazil, as Leonardo mentioned, which is a project funded by the Ford Foundation and Minds. And most of this work is a result of my interaction with Ian. Ian was my PhD advisor, was my professor, my mentor, and I have learned a lot throughout those years. And most of my work, when I learned about Minsky and financial regulation in the US, was precisely when we had a discussion about how to re-regulate the US financial system. So we had basically to go over those proposals and then evaluate those proposals from a Minskian perspective, which I learned a lot doing this at that time for Ian and his team. And back in 2011, and I have had, like I said, several interactions with Ian. Usually he has been a great host too. Like Leonardo said, he's shy, he doesn't like us to say those things, but I'll say anyway. And we live close to each other in New York, and usually we would talk for over the weekend. Like I said, he always received me with open arms, and we'd be discussing about the economics and the Brazilian economy. And that's to provide the background about this project. Was back in 2011 when I decided, following up our conversation, to say that if Minsky is right, that is, if Minsky Basic's idea, that is, stability is stabilizing, that is, stability is going to change behavior, then the Brazilian economy would be a perfect case to look at, right? We had a period in the 2000s that the Brazilian economy was experiencing a significant economic growth, with credit, rising leverage, rising GDP, falling unemployment, and that's precisely the kind of things that Minsky was saying, that is, you should look at financial fragility indicators when you have an economic expansion, right? So the idea was then in 2011 that I decided to write this proposal, talk to both Ian and Leonardo about this, and then this is the multi-year project that was funded by the Ford Foundation, and we have finalized the major research efforts on this. So for this all, I want to thank both Ian, Leonardo, and of course the Ford Foundation. And this is the report, one of the reports for this project on financial fragility and instability, and it's available on Minds' website, minds.org.br. And it's a 100-page long report. I'm not going to go over everything that I have here. You can go to the website and download this report. But what I want to do today, because I was told that I only have 20 minutes, I'll try to summarize the main findings for this research. And in Brazil, if you look at the debate, right, that I have today, I have basically two views about the Brazilian crisis, right? One, and that's the mainstream view, is that the current crisis was caused by bad policies, right, that were implemented over the past 10 years or so, right? So that was bad management, bad macro policy, subsidized credit, and then I have Brazil's National Development Bank. They put that into account. Creative accounting, right? Budget out of control. That's usually the arguments that you find on major media outlets, and that have a rising public debt, right? So all those things combined, you have a scenario in which you have the deterioration of public accounts, and by doing that, you're going to lose confidence, investors' confidence, and then interest rates will go up. Investment will go down, and that's the recession that we have in 2014, okay, or at least declining investment. Actually, the Brazilian Bureau of Economic Analysis revised the numbers for 2014, but for this case, what matters is that investment was falling in 2014. Okay, so that's the mainstream view. What I'll try to provide today, and like Ian said, I also like to state my conclusions first and then work backwards, right? So I'll say up front my conclusions. That is, the alternative that provides that this crisis, the Brazilian crisis, is a Minskian crisis, right? That is, you can find components in terms of financial fragility and stability that then you'll be able to characterize the crisis as a Minskian crisis, right? So that's basically my point. And throughout those years, the basic research effort that was done was then to collect data, right? So I have an idea, this presentation has more than 100 slides. Usually I do this in more than 1 hour to go over the basic points, right? To show financial fragility indicators at the macro level, at the micro level, and then combine this framework. So, like Ian said, if you use Minsky, you have this component, right, about returns, that is demand price and supply price. So Minsky used this. And if you use some external funds, you have to add other components, the borrower's risk and the lender's risk. And in all this, Minsky also introduced in his analysis Kalecki's profit equation, right? That is, Minsky was saying, look, if you do rely on leverage, then you have to validate those financial commitments. One, you can refinance those things, right, by going to financial markets, or have to generate enough income to then meet your financial obligations. So Minsky was always looking at the profit equation because this in itself is an identity for the macroeconomy, that is how profits are created at the macro level, right? So this one is going to be extremely important for us to understand how profits behaved after the global financial crisis of 07, 08 for the Brazilian economy, right? And I'll say up front, there's a sharp decline in aggregate profits for the Brazilian economy after 2010, okay? So the data is showing all this. And then you have the Brazilian economy, you have, economic growth, you have the 07, 08 financial crisis, you have a recession which was short-lived, and then you have a wave of optimism here in 2010, you have a series of policies here introduced in 2011, there was also a very strong fiscal contraction in 2011, in addition to other measures, macroprudential policies that were put in place. But also, since 2010, there's a sharp decline in profits, like I said. So here, the idea is to look at profits. You have profits that have been declining since 2011, right? It's the same trend that investment was also declining following these declining profits, okay? I'm not going to go over, the oil market, what happened outside the Brazilian economy, but this one is important to say that all that economic model that was in place, that Brazil relied, as Ian was saying before, that is exports, which is this red line, as a driving force for the Brazilian economy, for emerging markets economy in general, that no longer is there. Okay, so that contribution here, exports, is on this right-hand side right here. Okay, so in terms of contribution for economic growth, that was not there, right, following the global financial crisis of 07, 08. Now, to characterize this crisis as a Minskian crisis, you have to do basically two things. To find financial fragility at the macro level and at the micro level, right? So the first one, at the macro level, you have the Brazilian economy in the 2000s, rising profits. So the gray line shows net profits, okay, rising, falling 2002, from 2002 to 2006. The return on equity, which is this dark blue line, also sharply increased. So have a scenario that, one, you have extremely low leverage for the Brazilian economy right here. And then have rising profits and rising return on equity. Of course, investors, entrepreneurs will go ahead, expand their balance sheets and invest more, right? So like Minsky said, this wave of optimism is going to drive the use of more external funds. And these, you cannot see from here, but this bottom area here shows the component of investment that was financed using internal funds. Like Minsky was saying, over the cycle, you have an increasing reliance on external funds, which is this component here. You do leverage. Okay, so the component of investment that's financed using internal funds, that is out of pocket, that you use your cash, sharply decreased, right, from 70% to something like 50%. So that's the first component, have rising leverage in this period. And then the idea now is to understand the behavior of that financial fragility at the macro level that I told you. So use this identity that was widely used by Godley, which shows that if one sector is running a surplus, necessarily the other sector must run a deficit, right? Because the sum of those balances must be equal to zero, necessarily, right? This is an identity, it's not a theory. So, and then, if the goal is to understand financial fragility inside the private sector, you can isolate the private sector on the left-hand side of this identity, which shows that the conditions in which the private sector can run a surplus is only if you have on one hand an external surplus. Okay? That is, if you're running surplus, so that's the first condition. And the other condition is, if you don't have a surplus here, if it's balanced, then the only way the private sector can accumulate net financial assets over time is only if the government runs a deficit, necessarily. Okay, this is an identity, again, it's not a theory. And then you get the data for this. For the Brazilian economy, was a lot of work done because this was not available. I had several interactions with members of the Brazilian government to gather this data. Which is interesting is that, look at the red line, which shows the domestic private sector balance. From 2002 to 2007, right, that Jan said that was the phase of the bubble economy, right, the flip side of all the leverage in the US economy, the private sector, the domestic private sector in Brazil was running a surplus that was roughly equal to 5% of our GDP. That is, per year. The private sector was accumulating net financial assets per year by 5% of our GDP. That means that we have very strong balance sheets, right? Very strong balance sheets. And boy, oh boy, you're going to leverage if you have strong balance sheets here and if you have a wave of optimism. But then you have the financial crisis, and this completely changed. No longer the domestic private sector is running a surplus, but it's now running a deficit. This means that your accumulation of financial obligations, your liabilities, are growing faster than your assets. All right? That is, there is an increase in net debt, your net obligations. Okay? This cannot go on forever. In all economies that do this, in all of them, for the Eurozone, for the US, you name it, for all of them, these cannot go on forever. At some point, to have the reversal of this behavior. In all of them. There's no exception to this. Okay? And then you look at the Brazilian economy. Because inside the private sector have basically households, non-financial companies, and then banks. Right? So the idea now is to understand what is the sector that was running these deficits. So here you have banks, the blue line, running surpluses, right? So it was not the banks that was running deficits, right? So actually they had a very nice surplus here throughout those years. Very low leverage is the flip side of this story. The green line here, you have the household sector until 2013, okay? So it was running a small surplus. If you break it down by income classes, it's different, right? Because then for some household groups, they're running deficits. But overall, at the aggregate level, they're running a small surplus until 2013. Now look at the red line. They have no financial companies. Since 2007, this sector started running deficits. Now, in itself, this is not a big problem, right? It's normal that companies, at a certain point in time, they're going to spend more than what they get. That is, they rely on financial markets to finance their activities. That's normal. What is not normal is that you have this behavior, it deteriorates over time, okay? And it gets worse and worse. By 2010, it was roughly equal to 4% of GDP. That means that your financial obligations are growing at this rate, 4% of GDP, okay? Again, at this point, you're going to reverse all this. What is the variable adjustment? That is, what is the main component, if you look at non-financial companies, of expenditures? Investment, right? At some point, you're going to try to run a surplus, and the way that companies do this adjustment, is by cutting back investment. So it should not be surprising that investment has been declining for 10 consecutive quarters. 10 consecutive quarters. Companies are doing this. They're desperate, trying to cut bad expenses, and one of the most important expenses, if you look at a non-financial firm, is precisely fixed capital investment, and that sharply declined because their balance sheets were impaired. Okay? So more data. And then I'll say, when most economists, if you look at the main newspapers in Brazil, when most economists are looking at public debt, they're looking at the wrong one. They should be looking at private debt. They overlooked, they dismissed the fact that private debt, and here only put firms and households, increased from something like 30% of our GDP to almost 80%. 80%. More than double. Again, if you increase your leverage like this, somehow you have to generate enough income to validate those financial obligations. And if you don't generate enough income, you're going to cut bad expenses. What kind of expenses? Investment. So this to show now in billions of dollars, right? So you grow from something like, and this again, that's just for non-financial companies and households, from $200 billion in 2002 to roughly $1.8 trillion. It's more than 600% increase. And I open the newspapers, most economists are talking about public debt. It's amazing. Amazing. And I say, and by the way, what I did, I compared the rate of growth, because when you look at leverage cycles, what's important is the rate of growth, right? The first derivative. Brazil and China had the same rate of growth, roughly, right? I did this. It's not here, but I did this. So, and here's to show that not only that leverage was done in domestic markets, and I say here that investment grade in Brazil, it was a curse or something that was blessed, right? Because as soon as Brazil got investment grade status, you have a sharp increase in foreign debt by non-financial companies. And that was the end story right here, right? So what is the flip side of this? So have here by banks, non-financial companies, intercompany loans, the kind of, you name it, they did everything here to leverage. A sharp increase for all of them, and the government actually is this orange line, did his job, which is not to issue debt in a foreign currency. They learned their lesson, right? But now, because you created that stability that no longer have an external crisis like we used to have in the 1980s, because the government was borrowing too much in an external currency, you created that stability, but now, who did that? The private sector, like Ian was saying, okay? So, and here's to show the kind of, bonds being issued that received investment grade status, right? As soon as Brazil received that, most companies were borrowing funds because now we have cheap money abroad. And the flip side of this is something that Ian does a lot in his work, is that if you do rely on external financing, then you have a sharp deterioration of your current account balance, right? Because then you have to repay those things. It's not for free. Foreign direct investment is not a free lunch. You have to pay back principal and interest payments and dividends as well. So you have a deterioration of your current account balance. Why is this important? Well, because if you have a deterioration of your current account balance, which was something like 4% of our GDP, it means that profits are being destroyed at this rate, okay? 4% of our GDP. Now, the story is that you have rising leverage. Now, if you put something on that side of your balance sheet, now I have to look at the asset side. That is, what are your assets and what kind of returns they generate. Right after 2010, here you have return on assets and the return on equity for the green line and the green line. They declined by more than 50%. So you have rising leverage for non-financial companies, and the returns decline by more than 50%. Okay? And that also followed the destruction in profits here. Profits are destroyed. Okay? So remember that story. Profits are created at the macro level. At the micro level, firms are not able to generate those returns, so they couldn't validate their financial obligations. So that's what you have for firms, right? So the difference here is between what they spend, which is this portion here, and this is what they get, the funds that they get, right? So that's the deficit. That somehow you have to adjust this. How do they do this? You cut this portion. You cut your expenditures. And by doing this, you mainly mean investment. And look at this. This is the return on equity for public traded companies. You have for by quartile, and that's the median. 86% decline. And this is the data that comes from the central bank. Now they finally are generating this kind of data. 86%. Okay, the decline in return on equity. If you look at all the indicators of financial fragility, right, your earnings before tax and depreciation and amortization over your financial expenses, it also sharply decline. Okay, sharper decline. So now you have a scenario that you have rising private debt, you don't generate enough earnings, okay, to validate those financial obligations. Most companies are in a Ponzi scheme. That is, now you have the understanding that they don't generate enough cash flows to even pay their financial obligations. Okay? So what is the result of all this? So just to show you one more piece of data, the return on equity for the industrial sector declined from 14% of GDP to minus 10% in 2015. Who's going to invest in this scenario? You have your balance sheet is impaired, rising leverage, you don't generate enough cash flows, you cannot meet your financial obligations, and if you do invest, you have negative returns. That's why I say, look, even if in a scenario that the central bank, the Brazilian central bank, decides to cut rates to 0, you still have negative carry. Even if you decide to invest, negative carry. You receive less than what you pay. Okay? And on top of this, your capacities is at record lows. So, anyway, I want to close all this because what the government decides to do, that have a scenario of falling returns, is that the government decides to cut the cost of capital, okay, by doing tax cuts and other subsidies. And that was roughly close to 2% of our GDP. And then I said, look, if this is a Minsky crisis, and this was done back in 2014, this was published in October 2014, I said, look, if this analysis is right, if this is a Minsky crisis, then the private sector somehow is going to start deleveraging, okay? And if the private sector starts deleveraging, then my simulation was that the government deficit would reach 90% of our GDP by the end of 2015. By the way, that was when the markets in Brazil were still expecting positive growth for the Brazilian economy. Back in October 2014, I said, look, if this is right, if the private sector decides to deleverage, that's going to put pressure on our public accounts, and deficit will be equal to 90% of our GDP. And at the same time, I said, look, government deficits of this size are politically not feasible. Because in all major economies that have deficits approaching 10% of GDP, then have the discussion about austerity, okay? And that's precisely what happened, okay? So when you have the implementation, then you have after the election, you have a sharp contraction of public expenditures, which is this blue line, okay? And that puts the economy in the second phase of the deleveraging cycle, that the government now is compounding the problem, okay? And I like to say that now we are in the third phase of the deleveraging cycle, which is the crisis that we have for states and municipalities in Brazil. So I'm very pessimistic about all this. Interest rate cuts, they're not going to do the job to repair those balance sheets. Like Ian was saying, you need to generate domestic demand. But now we have a situation that the government is not willing to do this. You have the proposal to cap government expenditures. And Brazil, like Ian said, you should not be in this mess to begin with. You should have avoided doing all this. But now it's going to be very hard to resolve the situation given the political situation in Brazil. Thank you.
All right. First of all, thank you for the invitation. It's great to be here. I guess I started by looking at the title of this conference, Rethinking State Capacities, and I'll tell a story of the loss of state capacities in Brazil. It is a sad story, almost as sad as the one Felipe and Jan just told, except that it's the same story, so it makes it more tragic. I'll look at from another aspect, though. All right, so good old times, 2005 to 2010, and my focus here will be on, I guess, the economic policy framework, even though the story I'm going to tell about wrong policies, right policies, which policies would have been the best ones, are perfectly complementary to what Felipe and Jan have shown. So I guess during those times, of course, we had good external conditions, but I would argue that these are not sufficient to explain the boom we had. It's not a huge boom, but I guess for Brazilian economic history, it's good enough. These conditions allowed for good policies to be implemented. I'm not saying these are the best possible policies, but it worked. As well as, I would argue, afterwards, or from 2011 on, it's also not a matter of just being unlucky. Of course, the external situations were bad, but I would argue these were also very bad policies given the situations. Okay, so in a way, what Felipe said at the beginning of his presentation, that there are two alternative views on these crises. One is blaming on policies, the other one is attributing to a Minskian crisis or dynamic the situation. I would consider I'm a little bit in between there, because I would say that the policies were bad given the situation, and maybe Felipe agrees with that anyway. So the conditions there were basically, I would say there are two main pillars of what this strategy was. There were policies aiming at distributing income, and this generated some sort of virtuous circle where you have labor markets that are being heated, and especially through demand for services that are really labor intensive, and not only labor intensive but also demand low skilled labor, which made wage inequality fall, and feeding back into the same sort of mechanism where you have mass consumption as one of the drivers. The other driver was public investment during those periods. During this period, I'll talk a little bit more how. I'm talking about investment in infrastructure in general, but also on what I'm calling social infrastructure, namely education, health, and there is a big increase in those expenditures. So if you look at fiscal policy pre-2008, and I'll subdivide the period in two, pre-2008, so you have, on the one hand, social transfers. You had a minimum wage policy that was quite aggressive. Even if we had minimum wage, real increases since price stabilization in '94, it is clearly a higher rate of increase from 2005 on. Of course, due to the good external conditions and higher growth, this was made while reducing public debt. When it comes to monetary and credit policies, well, you had a strong accumulation of international reserves, so in that sense it was also good policies in a good context. It allowed us to recover quite quickly from the 2008 crisis, together with other things. You had a gradual reduction of interest rates, even if not enough, but still rates were reduced, especially up to 2007. From 2008 on, it wasn't the case, especially as price and food prices and other prices have started growing and inflation picked up a little bit. The strategy was also based on an exchange rate appreciation, which we saw some of the reasons for. There was a huge commodity boom and carry trade and so on, and the government also took advantage of it in a way to keep inflation down while having this process of higher wages and strong labor markets which would accelerated especially services inflation and non-tradable inflation in general. So the stability of the currency sort of helped compensate for that and keep inflation down during that period. You had credit expansion, so public housing, a big role of BNDES, also agricultural credit. These were sort of the economic policy set up then. The performance of the economy was quite good during that period. It worked. Of course, the boom helped. But if you look at several indicators, it was what we had. I would say the best time we had almost in 20, 30 30 or 40 years, right? Some of these indicators we can look here. So when it comes to inequality reduction, it wasn't huge if you look at the Gini index as a whole, given that the top 1% maintained its share in income. But if you look at wage inequality, it was quite strong for the reasons I just described. You had minimum wage increases and mass consumption, which increased demand for certain services, which also increased or which were intensive in low-skilled labor, and that reduced the gap between minimum wages or low wages and average wages in the economy. Consumption and investment, well, you see a lot of people talking about, well, then it's a consumption-driven model and that's unsustainable. In any case, it's doomed to fail. That's not really the case. If you look at the entire period, you saw a larger increase or a larger expansion in investment than you saw in consumption. And I mean private investment. So these things happened together. You saw consumption, you saw investment. Things were pretty much working out well up to 2010, right? External debt was falling. That's government debt, of course, not private debt. And that entire setup allowed us to recover quite quickly from the 2008 crisis. And in 2010, in fact, we had the highest growth rate in this period, 7.5%, right? So the recovery, of course, was due to the pre-crisis programs, which were already implemented and set up. So BNDES was already strong, as well as the Growth Acceleration Program, PAC, what they call PACT, was already set up with a huge project for different infrastructure investments, and this was already prepared even before the crisis, so in that sense we were quite lucky. And we had a very strong domestic market, which was resilient to this thing. We also had some temporary actions. Of course, a credit line from the BNDES, which worked out well in that time because you had a cycle of investment with firms that were of course surprised by the crisis, but who still believed that, I mean, who had an investment plan before. You had, even if it was delayed, you still had a reduction in rates since 2009, some tax cuts, transfers to state and city governments, as well as other measures such as an increase in duration and extension of unemployment insurance, and these were temporary actions that helped. And you had some new structural actions, a housing program that was started by that time, Minha Casa Minha Vida, as well as some new tax brackets that reduced tax rates on the low middle class. This seemed quite well. We did well after that, but there was a problem, and that problem was the main object of discussion back in 2010, which was, well, sure, this is all working out well, but the industrial sector or the manufacturing sector is not doing that well. This consumption is being satisfied with imports, which explains the difference here between industrial production, which is the blue line, and retail, which is the red line. So retail picked up quite well after the crisis, but industrial production didn't really. And at that point, that was the discussion. So you had all sorts of suggestions for the economy. So the people who would say, well, you need to devalue the exchange rate quite a lot and very quickly. At the same time, you had the people who would say, well, not really, this is fine. I mean, while the commodity boom is working, you shouldn't really be concerned about this. And other people who would talk about actual industrial policy and so on, right? But this was a concern. The answer was what I provocatively call the Fiesp agenda. And the Fiesp, for those who don't know, is basically the Federation of the State of São Paulo of the manufacturing sector. And I call it this way, and it's not because I want to say these policies were necessarily aimed at only favoring this sector. I'm sure these were designed as something that would be good for Brazil. Still, I would argue these are not policies that were well designed for the timing and for the situation that developed afterwards. Okay, and well, the first thing in the agenda was that you needed to do a fiscal adjustment in order to allow for looser monetary policy. So this was a consensus almost among people around that time, that if the economy is sort of overheating, and there was a big concern about, well, 7.5%, that's crazy, you should probably, inflation is going to pick up, so you should probably do a different mix. You should promote a fiscal adjustment, at the same time reduce interest rates, right? And that's what Dilma Rousseff has done after taking office, and I'll show the data. She did a strong fiscal adjustment in 11. She increased the primary surplus in more than 1% of GDP, while reducing public investment quite a lot. So one of those two pillars that I'm talking about, mass consumption, investment, it was abandoned since 2011. And the replacement for it was a whole set of incentives for the industrial sector, which was in pain, and therefore had to be helped, right? Except that, as Felipe just showed, this private sector was already running into that, and of course there was also some bad luck at that point, because you had an European crisis that started reducing world exports, and the whole idea that you would switch from a consumption model into maybe some sort of Asian type of model where you would increase your share in world exports and turn into some external oriented economy, that of course could not have worked given that the world economy crashed and no exchange rate devaluation would have been enough unless we would turn Brazil into Bangladesh in two or 3 months. No sort of devaluation would have worked for in this type of context, right? The problem is, since you do that, and public investment first it falls and then it stagnates for the rest of the period. When you do that and it doesn't work, so private investment does not pick up, and in fact you have to deal with new problems. So a fall in exports, consumption that was the only thing you had, basically with inflation picking up at that point anyway due to the exchange rate devaluation, starts stagnating. There's no demand anymore, and the cut in public investment, which would be maybe one thing you had, you contribute to the situation, to a deceleration, a slowdown, and in that context, companies were already running into that, and they're seeing that slowdown, and they're not willing to invest, right? But you keep trying. So you keep extending tax cuts. You start with a very focused tax cut story where you'd basically give it to some sectors that would be strategic, but then Congress and also the government themselves start extending this to all the sectors, even non-tradable sectors in the economy. So it's not industrial policy anymore, it's corporate welfare, really, using the term that some Americans are using to talk about Donald Trump's plan, and some other policies that have worked in the past, such as credit by BNDES, but at that point it works partially given that companies were already running into that and had no reason to invest. At that point, you had idle capacity building up, and there's no reason to invest. Namely, so giving credit does not work as much as it should, and you also have a choice to try to give to implement some public-private partnerships by giving out airports and roads and so on to the private sector to manage, but it also doesn't work because there's no one willing to do it, right? So that's the problem when you start relying on the private sector, and the private sector doesn't want to do anything, right? So it becomes some sort of transfer of social transfer to the private sector rather than an actual stimulus, right? I only have 5 minutes, so I'll go quickly here. Well, this is federal public investment. Maybe that's important to make the point. You can see that there's a big trend of increase in public investment since 2006 to 2010. Then in 2011, there's a fall. The light blue thing is the housing program, is Minha Casa Minha Vida. It's not really fixed capital formation. And there's a stagnation afterwards. So there's a huge change in the economic policy since 2011. So there are two models, different models. The one that comes after 2011 does not work. Inflation picks up, as it always does when exchange rate depreciates in Brazil. There's a big nexus that I can talk about more in another situation. The result of this is that there is a fiscal deterioration, of course. You have tax cuts, you have all sorts of incentives given, but you don't have growth. And so, in spite of expenditures have not really, I mean, expenditures, if you look, it's the orange here. So in this period, 2011, 2015, or 14, actually, this is wrong. You see that it doesn't grow more than before. But if you look at revenues, the situation starts deteriorating quite a lot, and that's the problem we're facing, and this problem becomes deeper in the past 2 years, of course, because then you switch from that agenda into another and even worse agenda. And that's the lessons of how to keep digging. So we know very well how to do it. If that's one of the objectives of rethinking state capacities, we know how to lose state capacity and to dig recessions. So you have a strong fiscal adjustment in 2015. People say it didn't actually happen, but it did. If you look at effective expenditures and remove what we call here the pedaladas, which are basically the budget tricks that led to Dilma Rousseff's impeachment. So if you remove that, as well as the despedaladas, which are the repayment of public banks for those tricks, if you take all that out, these are the fiscal data I'm dealing with here. So they're clean data, right? So especially these data here that I've just shown, it excludes all the pedaladas, despedaladas, and all these sort of things, right? So these are effective expenditures. You had a contraction in real expenditures of about 2.5% in 2015, if you take the despedaladas out. You also have more than 35% cuts in public investment in 2015, so that sounds like a big fiscal adjustment to me. You also had the raise in tariffs. I mean, the Argentinians have done the same now, and they're facing the same sort of problem. I mean, of course, it was a bad idea to keep those tariffs in the same level for a long time, but it's also a bad idea to release them out of a sudden at the same time, because you had 10.5% inflation. More than 40% of it is caused by the government itself. But in spite of this, the central banks raised rates. In the middle of a huge recession, the central bank reacts by tightening monetary policy. So it seems like we know very well how to dig. This fails completely at stabilizing debt. It fails completely at stabilizing prices. It fails completely at recovering growth. So, I mean, this is quite clear. We have the recession deepens. The fall in revenues, in government revenues, deepens. You have unemployment skyrocketing, a fall in real wages, and the quick reversion of that process of inequality reduction we saw in 2005, from 2005 to 2010. So now, after we learned how to dig, we're learning something else. We're learning how to make it permanent. So that's a new thing. Basically, then, as you all know, we have an impeachment process which is based on a compromise between some political leaders under investigation and some part of the economic elites of the country who wanted to avoid paying any costs for the crisis that they're facing. That new government starts, and since then the crisis deepens in spite of the promises on restoring confidence and all of that. Some of the states already are bankrupt. You're going to have more. Now it's Rio itself that is bankrupt, but also the state of Minas Gerais is the last one. And of course, this situation is only going to get worse, given that they have a law that is quite strict to respect and satisfy, given how much they earn as income or as revenues and how much they expend in Brazil. It's called the Fiscal Responsibility Law. Great thing, except that when a fall in revenues is huge, as it is right now, necessarily you're going to have states getting bankrupt, and the federal government is not doing much at the moment to solve that. And in the middle of this situation, what do? You approve a cap or a spending freeze for the next 20 years. So there is a huge solution, as Felipe has shown before, which is basically put in the Constitution that the government cannot increase real spending, can only adjust spending or total spending by previous year's inflation, and that will solve it all. So that's the next problem on the table, given that we have a fall in revenue situation. Why not solve it by freezing spending, right? That of course has implications for, it's part of the compromise of that impeachment process that will make public health systems and education system and infrastructure investment pay for the maintenance of other privileges, and especially the tax cuts that this corporate sector continues to have in spite of all of this, right? There's also a draconian reform of the pension system that has just been announced. People are going to work for 49 years in order to get 100% of their small pensions. And of course, you're probably seeing the latest news while you're here. There's a total collapse of institutions and a social chaos, which doesn't seem like the kind of thing that the confidence fairy loves, right? Even if the fairy exists. So that's the situation. I'm probably even more pessimistic than the previous two. I'm sorry for that, but I have to end. And thank you very much again.
Thank you very much. Okay, now we'll have a quick comment from Nelson Marconi from Getúlio Vargas, São Paulo. Then we'll have a quick coffee break without debates, because next to that we have a twin panel, which is very much complementary to this one. Yeah, no, it's the one on financing development, rethinking the public by private mix. After this panel, then we'll have room for debates. But let's try to keep it in time. And so, Nelson, the floor is yours, and try to be concise, which I know is going to be difficult. Thanks.
First of all, thanks for the invitation for coming to this seminar and to have the opportunity to comment these papers, not these papers, but those presentations, that they were very interesting, and they are, I think, Jan, Kregel, and Felipe are more linked presentations, okay, because they are talking about Minsky, the origin of their presentation are more the Minsky theory, and Laura is more linked to interpretation of the Brazilian scenery in the last years. Also Felipe. So I will comment in general and my of the three presentations, and I'll try to be very concise. So first of all, Jan Kregel presented a very interesting interpretation for Brazilian crisis, because it's linked to on the impacts of monetary policy and regulation on the Brazilian crisis. Yes, we talked about that another time. and you said that globalization, it was an important factor in order to reduce real wages in the United States, and then this allows to the increase of profits in the United States, and then it creates the opportunity to surge some kind of investments that could be done in Brazil. But since the financial system is completely deregulated, so the opportunity was to have large gains here, and the Brazilian enterprise has increased their debt. And then I want to ask him. I know that if you will not ask it now, answer now. But what will happen when the inflation will increase? Okay, probably United States with less competition. Yes, and the wages will also decrease in real terms more than now, and probably the interest rate will increase, and then the problem will, as you said another time, the problem will happen. We will suffer large problems with this inflation increase in the United States and this interest rates rise that will happen in the future, because probably our Brazilian companies, they are very indebted, like Felipe showed it to us. They will be more indebted than now. So if you think that Trump is not a real problem for us, I think it's we have to be very concerned about that, because the problems could be large for us. So related to Laura, to Felipe's presentation and Laura's, okay, and Felipe's presentation was also very interesting. He said about he tried to explain the Brazilian crisis using the macro identities. It's very important to use these identities to think in macroeconomic terms, okay. But what I want to comment is that the causality on this explanation that I used to do is a little different from what Felipe said. And okay, I agree with you that the private sector is completely indebted, and that we have the public sector was completely compensated that. But and then in this comment also is applied to Laura's presentation. Okay, we had the problem is that after the 2009 crisis, we have a huge leakage, okay, on our Brazilian economy, So what happens is that until that time, the world economy, the global economy was growing too much, and then you could export, and then you could with the revenues of the exports to promote all kinds of policies that Laura explained on her presentation. But after that, when the world economy declined, first, okay, we didn't have demand anymore for our products. Okay, so the enterprise in general, the global enterprise preferred to produce on the other countries than here. Okay, because the world demand is much more stick than before. The second point is that with our exchange rate appreciation, so what happened, the graphic that Laura explained there, okay, the difference between the industrial production and the sales were increasing, the difference, and then what happened, the private sector starts to lose profit margins more and more, okay, because of not only because of the exchange rate, the currency appreciation, but because of the interest rates, and because of the interest rates and the crisis that started also in Brazil, and then the profit margins decreased, and then. But why the profit margin decreased? Because of the exchange rate, because of the interest rates, and because Brazilian government starts to increase the interest rates in order to appreciate our currency and to control inflation. So in this sense, okay, private sector started to pay more and more to have lower profit margins, but then the government spends more and more with interest rates. So this is why the balance is completely it's completely unbalanced between private and profit and private and public sector. Okay, and then what happened is that after the crisis in 2011, 2012, the government tried to change the relative prices in the Brazilian economy. Okay, they tried to reduce interest rates and to depreciate our currency. In order to do that, I think at that time we had to do a control of aggregate demand. There is no other way to change relative prices. Okay, but this movement was not successful. Why? Because the Brazilian government cut investment. Okay, this is why I agree with you. So with you both, the Brazilian government cut investment at that time in 2011, and then it started to recover in the following years. It was not enough, and the depreciation was not enough. Okay, to recover the profitability of exporters, to reduce the competition with importers, and then in 2015, the Brazilian government decided to do another fiscal adjustment, and what he cut again? Investment. So in 2015, the Brazilian government cuts around 40%, no, 35% in real terms of the public investment. So it's obvious that you have a crisis. And then the revenue decreased, and then you have this fiscal situation that you can see nowadays. So, and the difference of my interpretation is the causality of this movement in the profit margin. Okay, for me, the question was the exchange rate appreciation and the interest rate that are rising and rising all the time. Yes. What you have to do? Yes, I will try to be more optimistic and more normative in the sense that what should you do? So we should. Obviously, you had a crisis in manufacturing in Brazil and also in the United States. This is very, very important to explain this crisis. But what should you do? Okay, we have to, first of all, recover the public investment on this point. Okay, we can say, okay, you have to recover private investment. That's fine, but private investment will not recover in this situation. There is no aggregate demand. Okay, it's not a problem of trust or insurance. It's a problem. Okay, insurance, yes, but it's much more a problem of scarcity of aggregate demand. Okay. Second, we have to recover again our exchange rate to make it more competitive. Okay, I will not talk too much about that because everybody says that I talk about that all the time. But the public investment is really important. Okay, in order to do that, okay, we need to do the fiscal adjustment. Yes, I agree that you need a fiscal adjustment, but it's a little different from what the government is doing. Okay, so we have to increase some taxes. Yes, for me the most important is to increase the tax to finance the retirement that is linked to more to countryside. Okay, that we call aposentadoria rural. And we have to also reduce, to solve another problems in the retirements for public servants, okay? And then you have to do this retirement reform. I agree with Laura that it's too strong, this reform, so it has to be more soft than they are proposing. But I am optimistic that the Congress will change this project. I also changed about the 20 years, but of the ceiling. Yeah, yes, the military. So, and yes, and then you finish. And also you have to give some solution for the debt of enterprise. So it's necessary to the BNDES and also the commercial banks have to give, not to give, but to open some lines to finance or to allow to help this enterprise that are very indebted to solve this, okay, to solve this problem. And BNDES, yes, they have money to do that because otherwise, against of paying for the treasury, they have to use this money to refinance this debt, okay? And in case of we have also some compulsory withdrawals, okay, that could be used to also to refinance this debt of the enterprise, okay? And then you can talk about a little more later, but the general idea is this, okay? You have to recover the public investment, you have to do a fiscal adjustment in current expenditures, and I know that we started that, but you have to do in a different way that is proposed by the government. We have to recover our exchange rates, and you have to refinance the private debt. This is essential, okay? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for 3 great presentations and also a very smart comment. And I think what we get from this session so far is that what is happening in Brazil today is that we managed to get not one piece of economic policy in place, in the right place. Everything is precisely in the wrong place. So that's really scary. Let's see what the next panel has to add to that. And we'll have a short coffee break, and we'll be back in 15 minutes, please. And we'll have the continuation of this discussion. Thank you.